First, I'm going to say that lecturing to an empty room is always awkward, so I expect this to be a little awkward. Secondly, I want to go back through KVP because it just can't be said enough. KVP controls so much stuff that even if it doesn't really control your contrast anymore, it still controls so much in output from the X-ray tube, interactions in the patient, changing the Compton PE ratio, that it just can't be stressed enough. So assuming that we have no other changes aside from an increase in KVP, we're going to produce more X-rays. More X-rays are going to be transmitted through the patient. So we're going to have a lower number of scattered or absorbed. However, the number that are absorbed are going to decrease much more rapidly than what the scattered are. So the percentage of Comptons increase relative to the number of photoelectrics that we have. So overall scatter increases percentage-wise, and what that would result in if we were looking at a traditional screen film image is contrast. Certainly the contrast is not as affected by KVP as what it used to be, but that was once our primary control of contrast was the KVP that we selected. The higher the KVP, the contrast decreased. Our lookup table now is really our better indicator, or our better control, almost exclusive control of contrast. So we ran through this earlier today. What does mass affect in the X-ray tube? That's just the heating of the tube, and it controls the number of X-rays, number of electrons that we have in the X-ray tube, and then that controls the number of electrons that we have in the beam. In the patient, as mass goes up, then patient dose goes up proportionally. On the image, what we get is an increase in exposure, so our index number indicates that we have an increase in exposure. But those sharpness recorded detail issues that we talked about in class today were the potential for blooming. If we use very high MA stations, we could also lose some sharpness recorded detail. I didn't mention this, but due to extended exposure time, which is a portion of mass, and also we could potentially lose sharpness recorded detail in the selection of focal spot. If we used an MA station that was too high for small focal spot, then we could lose sharpness recorded detail then. So changes in KVP, change scatter, increases in KVP, we get an increase in scatter, increase in exposure, no effect on sharpness recorded detail, all about visibility, scatter creation, and our patient dose goes up. That's assuming a change in KVP without an accompanying change in mass. So with a change in mass, we have no effect on the percentage of scatter. Overall scatter does go up, but as far as PE ratio changing, it does not. Our exposure goes up, sharpness of recorded detail can be affected. It's not going to have any effect on visibility of recorded detail unless our mass is way too high or way too low, so that we don't get a good image anyway. And then our effect on patient dose is to directly change. So then we talk about patient thickness. So, and I went through the registry review book questions that I see on the regular for this. And as patient thickness increases, our X-ray tube doesn't automatically magically shoot with more photons, but whenever we phototime, it does. But when we set a technique, if you make the same exposure on an aesthetic person versus a hyperesthetic person, your index number at your image receptor is going to indicate too low of an exposure for the hyperesthetic patient, because the hyperesthetic patient will absorb more X-rays, so we'll get more attenuation, fewer X-rays to the image receptor. And so our patient dose is going to increase in our obese patients, because with that absorption, we're talking about photoelectric absorption, patient dose is going to go up. Occupational dose can potentially go up if you're in the room in a fluoroscopic exam. So any change in tissue type, tissue area, tissue thickness is going to increase our scatter radiation. So the likelihood of the scattered photons penetrating the patient depends on the thickness. As thickness increases, most of those are going to, or a higher percentage of those are going to eventually become photoelectric inside of the patient. And scatter producing versus non-scatter producing tissue. If that's the case, then the scatter, let me see, let me back up. We'll go all the way back up to patient thickness. So patient thickness, options for compensating for changes in thickness would be your KVP or your mass. You could adjust either one. KVP is not preferred because as you increase KVP, you're going to increase, let me back up again. So patient thickness, options for compensating for changes in patient thickness will be that you can change your KVP or your mass. With the change in KVP, you're going to create more scatter radiation. You've got to remember your rules for grid use. If you get above 70 KVP or above 5 centimeters, so shoulder size roughly, then you need to utilize a grid. So if you would not shoot a specific body part, you enter the body part name with a grid because you're not at 70 KVP or above, and you adjust with KVP, you're going to have to introduce a grid. So that's what other steps might be needed. So how does scatter affect contrast? It doesn't as much as what it used to. With computer algorithm, the lookup table being the controlling factor for contrast, scatter radiation doesn't affect it as much as what it used to. It still can affect it. So how does it affect density? There's a lot tied up in that. So as scatter increases, with increased scatter lays down a layer of density on the image receptor. That's number one. So increase in scatter should, you would think, increase the image receptor exposure, and just substitute density for image receptor exposure here. So if we have an increase in the creation of scatter because of thickness, we're talking about thickness. If we have an increase in thickness causing an increase in scatter radiation, you might have the tendency to think, well, increase thickness, increase scatter, layer of density. So it would increase image receptor exposure, but it won't. With the increase in thickness, you're going to get more scatter created, correct, but most of that scatter is going to absorb inside of the patient. That additional scatter is going to be absorbed inside of the patient. So your image receptor exposure density actually decreases with increase in thickness. So how it affects patient dose, we just talked about that. It increases it. How does it affect how it affects scatter? The difference in tissue thickness, contrast, maybe some. Grayscale, remember, is the opposite of contrast, but they go hand in hand. So if it doesn't really affect contrast all that much, it's not really going to affect grayscale. With the increase in tissue thickness, exposure is going to go down. You can have some differences in sharpness, and that would be because of an increase in OID more than anything else. And then visibility is all about scatter, presence of scatter on the image receptor. So with tissue thickness, theoretically, visibility could decrease. Mass is a technical factor we need to adjust. And then we get to field size questions. So remember, when we're talking about exposing tissue, any tissue that we expose can create scatter radiation. And it doesn't matter if it's an area, like the length and width of an area or the thickness of an area. More tissue we expose, more scatter we create. So what we're going to talk about in this portion is, do changes in size necessitate changes in X-ray production? So what technical, if so, what kind of gives it away, but what technical factors should be used if that's the case? Do changes in field size affect penetration? How do changes in field size affect patient dose? How do changes in field size affect occupational dose? How do changes in field size affect scatter radiation? What are the options for limiting field size? How does scatter affect the image contrast? And how does scatter affect image receptor exposure? So when we're talking about scatter radiation beam limitation for controlled scatter radiation, the less tissue that we irradiate, the fewer scatter photons that we create. So what we're talking about in beam limitation is collimation. Remember your, not really word association, but your rules of collimation. If you increase collimation, that means to reduce field size. So the larger the field size, the less collimation you have. So decrease in collimation, increase in field size. Increase in collimation, decrease in field size. As we increase collimation, our scatter creation decreases. So beam restriction, that's what collimation is, beam restriction. It's not focusing the X-ray beam. And you usually have a person or two into their sophomore year that gets it in their mind that we focus the X-ray beam, and we're not. We're just, we're restricting the radiation exposure to certain tissue types so that we can block that radiation, reduce the patient exposure, and make an image with less scatter radiation. So we're not focusing the X-ray beam, we're just blocking a portion of it. So the purpose is to reduce the patient dose. If you remember back to the first semester, we talked about Rollins, the dentist, and he developed beam restriction by putting lead diaphragms inside of leather and putting it around the patient's head whenever he took x-rays of the teeth. So it's beam restriction. In his case, it was just for dose, but secondarily, then we get a change in image quality, specifically visibility or recorded detail, and traditionally what that went with was a change in contrast and density. Don't really see that all that much anymore. We still do have dose implications. There might be some, I don't know, negligible contrast differences between collimated and uncollimated. Compared to what we saw with screens and films, it's just not as prevalent, it's not as obvious as what it used to be. It still affects it. And density, again, is image receptor exposure, much more so than what it is density. I really need to go through these and change that, but it's image receptor exposure equals density. So as we increase our collimation, that means to reduce our field size, then our image receptor exposure is always going to decrease. So we have options. What are types of beam restrictors? We have collimators, and that's what you're most familiar with. Collimators are also referred to as variable aperture diaphragm. What that means, just breaking it down, variable means that you can change it. An aperture diaphragm is just a hole or opening. So variable aperture diaphragm is just a hole that you can open or close in order to block off some of the X-ray beam and the light so that you restrict how much tissue you examine. PBL is something that was implemented in the 70s. PBL stood for positive beam limitation, and with our image receptor sizes now in digital being a single image receptor size, you just don't see this that much anymore, but you might hear about it. I don't think it's on a registry, but you might hear about it. So what PBL is automatic collimation. So when we use different size of films, what the Bucky tray had in it were detectors, so that whenever you put a film size or a cassette size inside of that Bucky, it would detect the cassette size and it would automatically collimate down to the size of the cassette. It's really, really nice. You couldn't, without overriding it, there's a key on the X-ray tube that you had to turn off in order to open the collimation wider than what the film was. You could collimate down below the size of the X-ray film or the cassette, but you couldn't open it up any wider than the cassette size. So that's kind of a cool thing, is automatic collimation to make sure that people will collimate. So an aperture diaphragm is kind of like a collimator, except it's not variable. So what you've got there is kind of like what Rollins had. And that is, we didn't use leather, but it's just a hole in a big chunk of lead. So what we would have, and you might be able to see this on some of your x-ray units. If you look at the bottom of the collimator housing, you might see what looks like a couple of rails. And those rails should be parallel to to each other and on two sides of the little plastic window that you can look up and you can see where the light and the collimators are. Lower set of shutters. And that tray, that will extend three-dimensionally this beam restrictor and put it as close to the patient's anatomy as you wanted it to go. If you look through Merrill's, you'll see some images in Merrill's, and if you don't see them in Merrill's, once we get into critique in your sophomore year, you'll see some images where sinuses were done and the collimation is actually circular, and that's what caused that, was a collimation, a cylinder or a cone. Most common place I've ever seen those used were in sinuses. So those are your options really for beam restrictors. The purpose, again, for the beam restriction is to limit the tissue that you irradiate. Now, primary reason for that is to lower the patient dose, but secondarily, it blocks scatter radiation it keeps scatter radiation from being created. So everything that we've done so far has had to do with scatter creation. We're going to get to scatter cleanup here in a minute. But the proper KVP is about making sure you don't create an overabundance of scatter radiation. And the tissue type you couldn't really do anything about without compression. But here, again, we're into scatter creation, making sure that we don't expose too much tissue that would create scatter radiation that would then impact your image receptor. So how it affects patient dose? As collimation increases, again, increased collimation means a smaller field size. So as we increase collimation, your patient dose is naturally going to go down. So also, since you expose less tissue, as you increase collimation, you're going to decrease the amount of scatter that you create. Again, back to contrast, maybe. Contrast and grayscale, both, not so much. Exposure, though, this is where it gets a little conceptual. As you increase your collimation, you're going to lose photons. They're photons you don't want to begin with, but they're still photons that would go into the formulation of your index number. So what you've wind up with is a decrease. Your index number indicates a decrease in exposure. So as field size decreases, collimation increases, field size decreases, your exposure decreases. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second. Doesn't really affect your sharpness or recorded detail, but since it is a matter of scatter creation, then theoretically it could affect your visibility because it would give you a higher degree of scatter. So field size, we're going to talk about this in the exact opposite context of what we have so far. We've talked about an increase in collimation, which means decrease in the field size. So going the opposite direction with it, with increasing field size, we increase the number of photons in the primary beam, which increases the amount of tissue being irradiated, which increases the number of possible interactions, including scatter. So with that scatter created, we're going to spread a layer of fog across the image, which potentially could reduce contrast, increase image receptor exposure, leading to lower visibility or recorded detail. This is assuming that you were to take an image with collimation and then you remove the collimation. This is what the net result is going to be. More scatter, more image receptor exposure. And so we just talked about that. I'm going to go back through cones and diaphragms. So it's just an illustration of what your overall collimation actually looks like. So you've got two sets of collimators. I'm not talking about two sets of collimators in that you've got a set that comes in this direction and a set that comes in that direction. That's one set of collimators. That's your shutters that you see down here. That's what blocks your light, which should be representative of your radiation field. When I'm talking about two sets of collimators, what I'm talking about is you've got this first stage entrance shutter. I think I talked about this in class one day, but they are what we call multi-leaf collimators. And the multi-leaf collimators kind of form a cone. I don't know if you can really make that out, but it's showing a cone. So, but it's not a cone like a solid cylinder, like a cup turned upside down. What it is more like it's what we call multi-leaf collimators. So instead of a single broad cone, what it is individual little things that as we decrease collimation, they kind of separate and they spread and they come up like that to make a bigger hole. And then whenever we increase collimation, then we decrease our field size, then they come together and they squeeze together and form a much tighter cone. So the purpose for those is certainly to restrict the beam, but it's also for trying to limit off-focus radiation, or a benefit of them is to limit off-focus radiation. That little ding right there that you see that is coming down kind of like an X-ray beam, a single X-ray photon, that's what it's supposed to be representative of. So off-focus radiation is radiation that's created anywhere aside from the focal point or the focal tract on the target. So this being the actual focal spot here, anything that is made off of that is what we call off-focus radiation. And a couple of things about off-focus radiation. All right, so you've got electrons that you accelerate from cathode to anode. And imagine them as being like individual pieces of matter. And if you throw matter at something hard enough, there's the potential it could bounce. It's like a ball. So some of the electrons, as they travel from the cathode to the anode, are going to be traveling really, really fast. And what they might do is they might hit the focal tract, focal point, and they might have a tendency to bounce back towards the cathode. But the anode is still more attractive to the electrons than the cathode is. Cathode is still negatively charged, so they're going to return back over to the anode. And if they return straight back towards the focal tract or focal spot, then that's no big deal. But if they hit anywhere else on that disc, and in all of Bushong's drawing, he likes to put the creation of off-focus radiation right there. It could happen anywhere on that disc, anywhere on that disc. But if it returns with enough force that it creates an X-ray photon, that is what you call off-focus radiation. So off-focus radiation technically is any X-ray photon that is created off of the focal tract. So where it gets complicated is whenever we start talking about blooming. With blooming, we get a oversized electron field, right? So it's blooming of the space charge. So the space charge gets too big, so that whenever we send them across the tube, it might, the stream of electrons might hit somewhere aside from the focal tract. So technically it's off-focus radiation. It is. But we're not going to call it that. Okay, blooming that leads to off-focus radiation, we're just going to say is lost sharpness of recorded detail because of blooming. Even though it hits somewhere besides focal tract, we're not going to call that off-focus radiation. What we call off-focus radiation is that bouncing electron that bounced away from the anode, re-accelerated back towards the anode, and created an X-ray photon somewhere else. A little bit confusing, I know, but that's what they want you to know about off-focus radiation is that is off-focus radiation, as opposed to blooming is caused by too large of a electron field. Okay, so we have two sets of collimators. So two sets of variable aperture diaphragms, two sets of shutters. One catches off-focus radiation and reduces the penumbra. Remember, penumbra bad, umbra good. Penumbra means lost sharpness reported detail. So we'll want to reduce the penumbra in as much as we can. We want umbra, we want to get rid of penumbra. So if off focus radiation gives us more penumbra, that first set, the multi-leaf collimators on top of the collimator housing that you never see, are what's responsible for limiting that. And then the other ones are your variable aperture diaphragms. So a couple of things about your variable aperture diaphragm or your collimators. I'm going to edit this real quick. Positive beam limitation should not be there. That should be variable aperture. Aperture. Thank God for spell check. So those are the collimators that you're used to seeing. So there are two rules for collimation. One is the field size should never be larger than the image receptor size. So how do I say this? You can't record any anatomy that you expose that is larger than the image receptor size. So there's no point in exposing that anatomy. So if you have an image receptor size that is as big as this eraser, that's what this is eraser, and I expose my entire hand, there is no world in which I can put my entire hand on that image receptor. So the overall collimation should be no larger than the image receptor because you're just adding dose to the patient. You won't get any data out of it. So that's number one. It should never be larger than the image receptor size, but it should be determined by the size of the anatomy, right? So again, back to this. Well, let's, this is roughly a 14 by 17 sheet of paper, all right? Stiff paper, but it should never be larger than the image receptor. But in this case, is there any reason? So this again is a busy slide, and I've edited it from the same slide earlier. This is basically the same slide as what we looked at before. And I edited this one just a little bit, just to dial it in a little bit tighter and make it a little bit more applicable. So do changes of field size affect X-ray production? The answer is no, they don't. Again, there's nothing magic in the X-ray tube that if you increase your collimation, that you're going to create more or fewer X-ray photons. Do changes in field size affect the number of X-rays emitted from the collimator housing? And the answer is yes, drastically. With the increase in collimation, you decrease the field size, you decrease the number of photons that will expose the patient, and so your interactions in the patient, the resulting X-ray beam in the remnant beam is going to change as well. So increases in collimation reduce the number of X-rays emitted from the collimator housing, not from the tube housing itself, but from the collimator housing. So affect patient dose? Yes. As collimation goes up, field size gets smaller, patient dose goes down. Changes in field size affect occupational dose? Yeah, it can. As field size increases and collimation decreases, then you're going to create more scatter radiation, and potentially, that could lead to an increase in occupational dose. So how do changes in field size affect scatter? Increased collimation decreases scatter. Decreases in collimation increase scatter. So options for limiting field size are that equipment that we talked about before, the diaphragm, the cones, and the variable aperture diaphragm. So how does scatter affect contrast? Some latitude by the same amount in the opposite direction. As we, theoretically, okay, as we increase as we increase collimation, we reduce scatter, so contrast would increase. So with increased collimation, contrast would increase, latitude would decrease. Reverse that, and if you decrease collimation and increase field size, then contrast would suffer. Contrast would go down, latitude would go up. So does it affect image receptor exposure? This should be down here. How does scatter affect image receptor exposure? As we increase collimation, we reduce photons. With reduction of photons, we reduce not only what the patient's exposed to, but the image receptor is exposed to as well. So if you were to shoot a KUB, right? You shoot a KUB with a set technique, and then you go back and you shoot an AP spine on the exact same patient with the exact same technique, and what you're going to see is your index number should indicate that you underexposed the patient, or at least the exposure to the image receptor decreased. All right, so how do you compensate for it? Well, again, just like almost everything that we've talked about so far, our compensation for increasing collimation or decreasing collimation, either one, is going to be increased mass. And it's not going to be as dramatic as some of the other things that we looked at. Increase SID, you've got to increase your, with the increase in SID, you have to increase your mass by, square of the distance. But there is going to be a difference, and you can prove this out in clinicals. So again, mock up a patient, shoot through something that creates a lot of scatter, get a basin of water, make an exposure, collimate down, shoot it a second time, and see what your image receptor exposure is, see what your index number does. So how does scatter affect image receptor exposure? Increase in collimation decreases image receptor exposure. And how we compensate for that, invert those two. How we compensate for that is with mass. So as you increase collimation, you need to increase your mass. You don't see this happening really, because most of the time you're using phototimers, and phototimers are doing it for you. So you should, if you do the patient mock-up thing, you don't necessarily really even have to look at the image receptor and the index number. What you should be able to do is take a look at what the mass value was for the image that you shot without collimation, and the mass value for the image after you collimated. Now, the key to this experiment is to make sure that you utilize something that creates a lot of scatter. So find you a big bucket of some sort and put maybe, 6 inches of water in it. And collimate all the way out to the bucket of water, the edges of the bucket of water, make one exposure, and then collimate in for a second exposure and see what your mass values are. Set a technique and see what your index number, how your index numbers change. And, should help you to understand that a little bit better. So I did not bring my textbook, so we're not really going to run through this all that much, but you are going to have to know how to calculate field size. So we're going to we'll cover this in class on Friday of next week and actually do the math, but the formula in the textbook is a little bit more complicated, harder to remember than the way I have it set up here. So I'll just draw it out. We're not really going to work it here, but I'll draw it out so that you can kind of see what it looks like. So we're talking about field size calculations. There are 4 measurements that you've got to kind of understand. So what you're going to have are questions that say something to the effect that you got your X-ray tube, that's your tube housing, and then you've got a diaphragm, and it's at some distance from the focus or from the tube housing. And then you've got a specific SID. So you've got an SID here, and you've got a projected field size right? So you've got a distance between the diaphragm or the collimator housing and this diaphragm opening. You've got this distance, the actual size of the opening, and then you've got the field size, and you've got the SID. All right, so you got 4 different measurements there. And you can look in the Bushongs on 298, I think it was, 298, yeah. And you can look in the Bushong and see what represents what in that. But the easier way to remember it, this is a ratio type problem. And so it doesn't really matter how you set it up as long as you're comparing the right things. So, and that's the vital thing. All right, so the way I recommend that you work this is big over big equals little over little. So you got big measurements and you got small measurements, right? So this is a small measurement compared to this one. This is a small measurement compared to this one. But what we want to do is we want to make those comparisons equal, right? Or we want to keep those comparisons across from each other. So if we make this A and this B and this C and this D, and it doesn't matter what you call them, we just need to make sure that we set the similar measurements across from each other. So A is more like C and B and D are more alike, right? This is an area and an area. This is a linear measurement. This is a linear measurement. So this is big, so that would be C over, this is big, D, and we want to make the linear measurement and the area measurement the same. So you've got B, and B is a little, right? So B and D are the same. So we're going to put B over here, and then over on the opposite side, we're going to put the measure that's most like C, and that would be your A. So what you would do is, you would have 3 of the 4 of these measurements. And with 3 of the 4 of the measurements, what you would have to do is cross multiply and divide. So you'd cross multiply and then, divide by the result to solve for X. So what this would look like then is when you cross multiply, it'd be C times B is equal to D times A, right? And cross multiply. And the reason I say it doesn't really matter how you set that up, as long as you keep the like things across from each other, is because if you get into the test and you forget what goes on top. Well, what if we mess up and we'll put this big on top? So this big was D, right? So that's D. Then our other big is pretty obvious. It's going to be C. And if you don't remember anything else, remember, put the likes across from each other. So D was most similar to B. And that is going to leave, A. So now you cross multiply and you've got D times A is equal to C times B. D times A is equal to C times B. Exactly the same, okay? So any kind of ratio problem is like that. So you got 4 factors, this is to this as this is to this. 2 things over, 2 things are equal to 2 other things. It doesn't really matter how you set them up as long as you keep them, the ratios proper. So you keep the things that you're comparing directly across from each other. You can flip the entire thing, but you got to flip the entire thing. This is really too busy to get back into. So we're going to pull it up there, and we'll pick up with this on Friday. I'll edit this particular slide. That's way too busy. My eyes are crossing just looking at it. So we'll pick up there on Friday, And I hope that you're able to see some degree of the eclipse